All right, thanks. I'll just provide a little more background on myself because
Jim, do you want to put down the, if you hit the thing, the down arrow, it'll bring down a screen for you.
that would be helpful, huh? It's not coming. Okay, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself first because I'm not a professional designer, so you might be wondering why I'm presenting this seminar today, not being a professional designer. I've never actually taken a graphic design class, but I do have 20 years or so of experience in the industry and have just learned mostly by trial and error. So hopefully some of the stories I can share with you about mistakes that I made in design you can maybe avoid. So I originally got my start about 20 years ago when I owned and operated a small print shop in Hawaii, and I did mostly business forms and things like that, but I also did some marketing type forms where design became more and more important. And that's where I first learned design programs and really did learn just by trial and error. And then after about 5 years of that, I decided that working 80 hours a week or so for the rest of my life wasn't going to be that much fun, so I put the shop up for sale and decided to finish my degree, my undergraduate degree, because I had never finished. Once I started the shop, I never made it to another class again in college. So I decided to come here, only having worked for so long. When I first got here, I was pretty bored with classes, so I decided the only way I was really going to finish my degree was if I worked on campus full-time. So I got a job as the Packet Center Assistant Supervisor, was my first job over at the bookstore, and I was in charge of putting together all those lovely course packets that you buy. And so I did that for a while, and as I worked on those course packets, one of the things that became pretty apparent was that the next step up from a packet was a custom published book, as far as from the faculty point of view. So they would take their packet and then they would get approached by one of the major publishers in their custom publishing division and want to put it together into a little book. And the sad part about it was that often it took what had been a $5 or $10 packet and made it into a $50 book or a $100 book or something. And often there was no difference between the two. And so I thought, well, why can't we do that? So I proposed to my boss that we start BYU Academic Publishing, and that had to go all the way up the line, and we were able to get that going, and that was about 8 years ago. And our only purpose in that was to make textbooks better, faster, cheaper for the student. And so that's what I did for the last 8 or so years. And as I was working on those books, I also knew I wanted to continue with a PhD program of some sort. I just didn't know what. So I was in the situation that a lot of people in this program get into, in that I was doing instructional design work without realizing it. And so putting together these textbooks, deciding what was effective learning style, or the style for learning and so on, was really an instructional design process that we went through. And so at first, I didn't know about this program, and so I took a couple of classes in educational leadership. It really wasn't a fit for me. It was mostly about policies and procedures, and that wasn't what I was looking for. And so one day I was literally flipping through the graduate catalog, reading all the summaries when I came across IP&T, and thought, oh, this is what I do anyways at work. And so I enrolled in the program. That was several years ago. I've not been on the 2-year plan for the master's degree. I worked full-time, and so I, for the first several years, just worked on it part-time. And then last May, I quit and had my first child. And he was here a minute ago, but he's now off with his babysitter. So now I'm just working on finishing up the degree, and happily a mom also. So that is a little bit about me and how I got my start in visual design and also in instructional technology. So I've made this presentation around 7 different questions. And the first one is what I'm not going to talk about. And that is content and APA. So your content is for another class. It's whether your content's good or bad, accurate or not accurate. That's really not my concern. It should be good and accurate, but you have plenty of different classes that will talk about that. The other thing is I can't do anything about APA. There are certain rules there. If you're required to follow APA, then you just have to do it and accept the fact that it probably violates many design rules, but that's all right. That's the professional standard. But if you have occasion to not use APA and make something otherwise, then that is a good thing to do, in my opinion. So, what is the difference between art and graphic design? Anyone want to take a little stab at that question?
I don't know. I'm going to guess that graphic design has more to do with communication.
Exactly. So I borrowed off Wikipedia here, nothing too exciting, but graphic design is undertaken in order to convey a specific message. So it differs from art as I see it. Art is more about emotion, your own interpretation as the user and looking at art. But with graphic design, you want to communicate something specific and not leave it up to your audience to guess what you're trying to get at. And so our job as instructional designers is to help be the guide, to make sure that we can guide people who are using educational content. We're their guide through that content. And so in my view, this is all about making stuff pretty. That's how I've always referred to it. We need to make our stuff look pretty. And why do we bother doing that? Mainly because we are visual creatures. So about 70% of the sensory receptors in our body are in our eyes. And here's just a couple of quotes for you on visualization, how important it is, and the role it plays in getting through content. So I'll let you read that one by Colin Ware and this other one. So with graphic design, we can use it in addition to all the other instructional design tools we have. We can use it to help our role as the guide through that material. And because in the end, no matter how much political correctness training we go to, we still judge a book by its cover. And I have 2 examples of that. Several months ago, I ran across a news article about a study that the researchers took little babies and they took pictures that they had decided they had classified into 2 groups, pretty people and ugly people. And then they measured the amount of time that the babies spent looking at the pretty picture versus the ugly picture. And there was a statistically significant difference that the babies spent more time looking at the pretty pictures than the ugly pictures. So it's almost as if we're hardwired to appreciate beauty and prettiness and so on. The second example I wanted to give about why we should take the time to make stuff pretty is from my own experience with academic publishing with our first project, which was this book here, the physical science book. So when we got started, all we had to show really was packets. That's all we had ever done. And the physical science people at the time had a very dull-looking black and white 2-column textbook. The pictures, there really weren't any. They were just line drawings. And so they were kind of putting feelers out for wanting something different. And we got wind of this and made a proposal to them for what we could do. And we didn't have anything to show. We weren't able to say, here's what we can do for you. So instead I put together a proposal that was visually more like book-like than a proposal, than a standard business proposal. Unfortunately, since I don't work there anymore, I don't have access to the proposal, but I did keep a copy of one from American Heritage 100 that we did in a similar way, where we put together, this is a proposal, not the actual book. And so it talks about what we can do and the pricing and the procedures and all that. So we put that together for the physical science department, and we got the job. And so this was the second edition of the book, but the first edition was this exact thing, just in paperback. And after we got working on the project, I asked the faculty who had made the decision to let us do it, why he let us do it, because he had also received proposals from billion-dollar companies, the major textbook companies. It was one of the largest classes on campus, so thousands of books a year, and they had received proposals from the top. And he said, well, your proposal was prettier. And the other proposals were simple 8.5 by 11, just Word documents basically typed out. And it had all the information that they needed, but they didn't bother trying to convey to their audience any sort of vision of what they would be able to do for them. So we got the job because we were willing to take the time to make it pretty, and then we were later able to use that as an example to show other faculty of what we could do. Also on web design, I spent a bit of time at the bookstore doing web stuff also, and it's amazing if you Google studies on usability in web design and how people function through websites. They judge very quickly whether or not that website is worth spending any amount of time on within less than a second in some of these studies. That it's all about the visual, how visually appealing it is, rather than whether or not the content is any good. So the last reason for why we should make it pretty is, again, in our role as a guide. It just helps people get through the material. And in my view, there's no point in spending time on content if you're not willing to make it look pretty. And in the IP&T class that is on this same material, print media design, I've taught that class for the last couple of years, and I've been asked the question before, well, how much time do you spend on a project to make it look pretty? You've spent your time making the content, and then how much time do you spend making it look pretty? And that's been at first I didn't know, because it's always been a matter to me of just reasonableness. If we had spent so much time on this book that it ended up costing $200 a copy, there wouldn't have been any point to what we were doing. So there's a matter of reasonableness in there, but basically I've decided it comes down to paying your time. So if you have a project that you're spending 10 hours or so on, then in my opinion, you should spend at least an hour of that time making it look pretty. If you spend 10 hours on a project and spend 30 seconds making it look pretty, to me that's a waste. So I just offer that as a guide, and just like tithing, you can pay more if you want to. If the situation calls for it and you need to spend more time on it, go for it, just don't go overboard. Alright, so we've talked about why, and now why bother knowing the rules of design? This here, I like to collect bad examples of graphic design. So this is a real advertisement for Shaker's restaurant. And even if we're not trained as professional designers, it's one of those things that we usually can tell it's bad when we see it, even if we don't know why. But if we do know why, then we are that much closer to being able to fix the problem. And we can use those rules and concepts to start. It's hard to know where to start on that one, but we could just pick a rule and get going on fixing it. And so that's one of the reasons why, if we know the rules, we can use them. The book that I use in the 655 class is this book here, the Non-Designer's Design and Type Book. It's a really awesome book. It's an easy read, and I'd highly recommend it whether you take the class or not. And in it, she begins by explaining this with a tree story, and I actually have had the same exact experience with trees. And that is, when I moved into my current house, there were these two really unique looking trees in the backyard, and I thought I had never seen them before. There were these trees with these huge, like elephant ear-like looking leaves, and the previous owner was all, spending a huge amount of time, a disproportionate amount of time, explaining how to take care of this tree because it was so unique and important to her, and snow would ruin the leaves and so on. And I could have sworn I had never seen this kind of tree before. And as I moved in and started looking around the neighborhood, there are these trees all over Utah County. They're Captula or something trees, Captcha trees. And there's a bunch on State Street that I pass all the time, and a bunch on the street going to my house. And I'm sure they were there before I moved into the house. But it wasn't until I saw them and became familiar with them that I could pick them out of a crowd. And the same goes with design. If you know the rules, you can pick out what the problem is, you can use those and so on to fix things. So what are the basic design rules? In this book here, she has 4 basic design rules, and her acronym that they come to is CRAP, literally, C-R-A-P. And I think that she used a couple of words that weren't the best choices to convey, to make the acronym work. She picked, so I've changed the rules a little bit to be what, in my view, are the best words. And the first one is clarity. That when in doubt, err on the side of clarity over cuteness. So in this graph, these examples of a before and after graph, yeah, this little thing is cute. It's a travel thing, so they, obviously have a travel picture in the background, but it does nothing at all for clarity in conveying whatever information they're trying to give. And clarity is also about grouping information together in a way that is clear for your audience. And one of the best examples I've seen as a bad example of that, I don't have it with me, but I was in a doctor's office reading some local magazine, and David Archuleta was on the cover, and in the table of contents there was his picture, and then directly underneath of it was an article about, the title was something to the effect of the 10 top stupid things people do to cause divorce, or something like that. So it made it seem like he was stupid and he was in the middle of a divorce or something. If you looked, further over, you could see that he had nothing to do with that article, and his article was on a totally different page. But they completely violated all the rules of clarity by not grouping like things together. So the next thing, consistency. We'll go back to this Shakers ad. There is nothing consistent about this ad. They use all different fonts, all different colors, styles, alignments. Some of it's centered, some of it's not. There's just nothing consistent about it. And in design, you need to be consistent. It will help the user through the material by picking fonts and sticking with them. Here's a before and after example. This is just a photo of a table of contents with the same material over here. And when, for example, using headings, all the same font, don't pick different fonts. If like information is italicized, you italicize it, and so on. And so that is about being consistent. Contrast. You may have heard the old saying, if everything's bolded, nothing is bolded. So on the left here is the absolute worst example of a wedding invitation I've ever seen. There's really not any contrast. There is a tiny bit, and then it's used wrong. So if you look at this, read the actual words, because the contrasting color, black to the purple or whatever it is, it makes it look like it's Mr. and Mrs. Ken Johnson that are getting married to John Jones and not Debbie Johnson. So, very nice bad example. This one also, this is courtesy of Pam, thank you, when she was in the class. This was an advertisement she received in the mail, and somebody actually took the time to print this. This isn't handwritten, this is actually somebody printed this out, and then it even continues onto this card. And they're trying to sell furnaces. And, you know, who's gonna try to get through this? If you're the guide, you've just done a miserable job of guiding anyone through what your message is, which is to sell furnaces. There's no contrast, and besides it violating a whole bunch of other rules, there's just absolutely no contrast in there. And color. So I've ended up with 4 C's. I don't know if that's my acronym instead of crap, but color is the last one. And one thing I want to emphasize about color is that you can use color if you can't afford if you're getting something printed on the press or something, and you can't afford a full color project, you can mimic color by using shades. And so even if your document is in black and white, you can still use gray in there to make the illusion that there's some color in there. So on the left we have the original design of this flyer, and then the same exact words appear on the right hand side. So color can be used poorly, as it is on the right, along with a variety of other issues. Or color can be used to convey the message better and help people through what you're trying to say. I'll also show you another example. The Physical Science 100 book originally looked about like this, you know, just black and white on 2 pages. And then we were able to make it color on every page, and it ended up being cheaper than the black and white version. So with desktop publishing and with modern technology, that's possible these days. Yeah?
What created the cost difference? Because that seems counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, well, a lot of it has to do totally unrelated to the color issue, and that's just
Layout.
the publishing structure. Who was publishing it, how much money were they taking, and royalty issues and so on.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. So those, in my view, are the four most important design rules: clarity, consistency, contrast, and color. Does anyone have any questions on those before I go on? No, go for it.
I was just going to ask about if there's specific ideas about layout. There's probably more depth to each of these 4, but...
Oh yeah, definitely. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is that in an hour's time, I can really only cover the surface. So if you want the whole enchilada, sign up for the class. So that'll be my shameless ad for 655, IP&T 655. Every fall. Dan and I taught it last year. It was a lot of fun. and it's 2 credits. And before you think that that might not work, because at least for the master students, there's the 9 electives, and 2 doesn't, you know, it's easier to think of it as 3 classes of 3, at least it was for me. There are a ton of those 1 credit ones you can match it up with and easily get your 3 credits. Anyways, I'm in this, my main purpose is to convince you to spend the time learning more about design and learning the tools, not so much making sure you're an expert by the end of the hour. So, one of the things, if you want to do design, is, in my opinion, it is worth the effort to use the appropriate design software. I find it incredibly frustrating to design in Microsoft Word. It has its purpose. I did my little outline in Word. It has its place, but design isn't one of them. And the reason is it doesn't give you the amount of control that you need for design. So I'll show you a little example here. I have a picture of this. It doesn't show up all that well, but this is an actual printing signature off of the press over at the Print Services building. So this is how a book would be printed. And this is a family history book that apparently it appeared that a grandmotherly sort put the book together and spent, the printing bill on this was in the neighborhood of $40,000 because it was press printed in full color in about 500 pages.
Whoa.
So she spent $40,000 on the printing, but did not spend what would have been a much smaller bill having it professionally designed. And it is very apparent to me that it was done in Word, because there are the typical Word issues in here of there's not the appropriate amount of space between the picture and that. There are some examples where the photos are on top of the text.
Wow.
The running head at the bottom, or the running thing at the bottom, footer, is so close that by the time it's bound, you're not even going to be able to read it. The H is going to go into the binding. It has just all sorts of issues because Word, as we all know and love, likes to think for us, and it does things for us. This right here, you can't see it as a numbered list, so it's decided how to do the indent and so on. And with a typesetting program, for instance with InDesign or Quark or one of those programs, you have complete control over what appears on your page, which can sometimes be a bad thing, but because people don't always use control correctly. But I want to give the brief 1-minute version of where InDesign and paste-up programs, as they're called, came from. Before the current crop of design programs and our current technologies, but it wasn't too old because we did this when I was a student at BYU Hawaii working on the newspaper. We would get, for the stories, we would write our little stories and have them printed out, and we would take a big blank sheet of paper and run our stories through a waxing machine, cut them, and paste them on our paste-up board. And we would use rulers and other things to make sure they were straight and we had margins correctly and all sorts of things. And that's how we put together the newspaper. And that was at the beginning of desktop publishing. It wasn't much long after that that I'm sure it all went digital. But in the 50 years, 100 years prior to that, that's how things were typeset. You may have heard of a Linotype machine. There's still a company called Linotype, and it was literally a line of type that would come out of the machine. You put it through a waxer and paste it on your paste-up board. And so your paste-up board is literally a blank board that is to the correct size and proportion that your final product is going to be, and you would put it together that way. So when desktop publishing first emerged, the programs are all designed around that concept of a paste-up board versus a word processing concept, which is what Word is. Word, you type and it just keeps flowing. It's on automatic flow sort of thing. The paste-up programs, you have a blank paste-up board, and they still call it a paste-up board. And you can make boxes and picture boxes, text boxes, and you can move them around and use guides and rulers to make everything precisely how you want it. And so that would be, as far as specifics of how to make your projects, it, in my opinion, is very much worth the effort of learning InDesign, or InDesign would probably be the preference here because it's really what's in the labs. It's what BYU has adopted as the platform of choice. And InDesign is a paste-up program that will allow you, if you're doing books, flyers, anything that requires more design than a Word document, it'll allow you to do that. IT services here, so if you go to it.byu.edu, they offer a series of quick and dirty, like hands-on courses on how to use InDesign, and each of the other kind of companion programs, with Photoshop being one and Illustrator being another one. And then of course in 655 we also go over them and do some hands-on training with Photoshop and InDesign and Illustrator. I'm sure all of you know what Photoshop is, where you modify your photos to make them look pretty. Illustrator is where you would use lines and make, as it implies, illustrations, and then you use what you make in those two things. They import quite nicely into InDesign. So all three are pretty useful as the actual tools. And then besides the little online courses that IT does and 655, IT also offers some online tools for training in Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator, some little video courses on how to use them. So I highly recommend starting there. So those are the BYU resources. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was project management. So when you're putting together a graphic design project, I've learned in the last 20 years by hard and sometimes embarrassing error that there are some things you can avoid if you just have good project management habits. And they really are habits that you just have to spend the time to get into. And they really are about not making stupid mistakes. If you'll spend the time to organize your projects and not make the stupid mistakes, it's really important, because if your content looks sloppy, that sloppiness will translate into judgments about the quality of what your content is. So the first one I'm going to steal from Mr. Covey, begin with the end in mind. And that's about knowing what your project's about and how you're going to distribute it. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this example doesn't show up too bad on the screen as far as why I've got it up here. But it's precisely why it doesn't show up bad. So with a picture, I'm sure you've all had the experience where somebody maybe will email you a photo and you'll go to print it out and it turns out totally blurry. And the reason for that is that the screen resolution stuff looks clearer at a lower resolution than on print. So this ad is actually, if you look at it closely, it's bitmapped. It's totally jagged, and it appeared in a magazine. So I would guess that this ad also appeared on a website and looked just fine on the website, because screen resolution is only 76 dpi, whereas print needs to be at least 300. They needed an ad, they just threw one in here or sent this one off, and as a result, everything in this is jagged. And so when we're beginning with the end in mind, that means we know whether or not we're printing something. Do we need something in high resolution or in a lower resolution, or what we're going to be doing with that material. Another concept in there, beginning with the end in mind, is to save all the original media that you develop in the course of a project. So, for example, one of the projects that we had at Academic Publishing was the MCOM 320 book. It's called Writing and Speaking for Business, and the faculty that we worked with for that book was awesome and really concerned about his students and not wanting them to have to pay too much money for the book. Just really great that way to work with. And he said, this book will never be in color because I don't want my students to have to pay for that. And so we did the whole book in black and white, and it was great. A few years later, we got pricing on what it would be to put that book in full color. And the price difference was so minimal because the quantities were so high on the book that he was all excited. Oh, yes, let's put it in color. Only we had not saved any of the pictures or photos that were taken for that book in color. All we had was the black and white versions. And so we had to redo all of the photos to get them in color. So that is, not all my examples are me doing the right thing, it's me learning from doing the wrong thing, which that was. So if we had saved our original media, because we did originally take those photos in color, we wouldn't have had to have reshot them. Another important thing is style sheets. And I don't have time to go into the details right now of style sheets. If you get into learning InDesign, that's, click on the help button about style sheets because they are a time saver and they're really important to making consistent quality designs. Style sheets are about defining what your elements are in your project, and then you only have to define them once. So for example, Word actually even has style sheets. For example, you could name a style as headline 1, and you have headline 1 in a certain font, in a certain color, a certain size, and so on. And every time you use headline 1 in your project, it will use that definition of the style. If you decide later on you want to change the color, rather than having to go and find all 50 instances of that style, you just change the definition and boom, it's all done. It does take a little extra time at the beginning to set up style sheets, but they're worth it. They're worth learning now. Even if you don't learn InDesign, they're worth learning how to do it in Word because they're such a time saver later on. The last thing I'm beginning with the end in mind is just to have a project folder. I can't tell you how many times I've seen projects where somebody developed something that had linked photos, but they didn't save the linked photos in with the project, and then it's printed somewhere else or they send it somewhere and the photos are nowhere to be found. So when you're working on a project, really a fundamental thing is to have everything for that project in one folder. So those are those. Okay, so one of my favorite project management tips is to always double check your work because you don't want to end up on Jay Leno's headlines. This little ad on the left here, you can see how just one word or one space put in the wrong place changed the entire meaning of the sentence. There have been some very real examples at BYU of similar, not this one didn't come from BYU, but I don't know how many of you were here when just a couple of years ago the Daily Universe printed a newspaper article about the Quorum of the 12 Apostates. That made the national news. And my own example, well, I'll give you a quick example first. In the American Heritage book, there was a paragraph in there about senators and how they serve 6-year terms, and we had inadvertently in 6 we had put an E instead of an I, and that was published that way in the first edition of the American Heritage Book.
Nobody
the-
reads that anyway.
In the word senator,
No, well, when we were describing the 6-year terms,
sex.
yeah, that's what it
I
said.
didn't know which word to go.
Yeah. So the very first time I had a really bad experience about not double checking was at my print shop. I had this lady that faxed in an order for some bumper stickers, and the order came from American Samoa, which was, that alone was kind of odd because I usually didn't get out of island business, but for however she found me, and she faxed in this order for bumper stickers. And apparently they get some non-voting congressional seats or something in American Samoa, and these bumper stickers were in Samoan and said something to the effect of elect so-and-so for Congress. And so I'm looking at this bumper sticker and I thought, is that a U or a V? And I thought, oh, it's a V, there's no doubt it's a V. And so I actually didn't even have the equipment to print bumper stickers. That wasn't a normal offset printing item. And so I sent the bumper stickers off to be printed on the mainland. And they came back, and I didn't check with her as to really whether it was a V or a U. I just sent off the order. It came back, and she flew in from American Samoa to pick them up. And she comes into my print shop, I'm all proud because they turned out pretty, and I hand her the bumper stickers, and I thought she was going to punch me. She was crying, yelling, screaming, "This is a U, not a V." And she just, it was horrible. It took maybe a half an hour to calm her down to where we could even have a conversation. And so I agreed to fix the situation. I wasn't sure quite how I was going to, but she told me when she was leaving from American Samoa, for American Samoa, and it became apparent that there wasn't going to be time to send them back to the mainland to be printed, that I needed to find somewhere on the island that had a machine that would print these bumper stickers. And so I ended up paying a printer in Honolulu 3 times what she had paid me for the bumper stickers to print them on an overnight basis and to get her the bumper stickers. And so from then on in my print shop, I had both bumper stickers on my wall to double check. And one other thing about double checking is on important things, which almost everything that is worth designing is, you can't be your own double checker. Whenever I violated that rule, it's ended up being a bad thing. When you've spent the time writing it and developing the content yourself, your eyes just go right over any errors. And that's pretty much what happened with the 6-year or 6-year term error in the American Heritage book. So the last thing on project management is to back up and back up and back up. It's amazing considering how cheap hard drives are and how plentiful storage is, how often it is still a problem and people lose all of their work because they haven't backed it up. So I have 2 examples and then I'll be finished. And they're both related to the physical science book. So when we first started this book, at the time it was called CID, now CTL. They had just finished an online version of the class Physical Science 100. And they had developed some content that we thought was pretty and that would work well in our book. In particular, they had made some screenshots as headings to each of the chapters. So each chapter has kind of a pretty page that we call the splash page, and then the rest of the content, more like, just the eye candy part of the book. And so they had developed screen versions of what we would call a splash page. And we wanted to use the same those same images for our chapter headings in the book because we felt they were good, and why bother reinventing those, and it was for the same class. There'd be some consistency there, and it'd be cool. So we go over to borrow, or see if we can borrow these images, and they said, sure, but all we have are the actual screen resolution finished JPEGs, because our hard drive crashed and we no longer have any of the originals for anything for this course. And the budget for that development had been in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At least this is what I was told. This was secondhand, admittingly. But it was just a little flabbergasting that in that big of a budget, there was not multiple backups. And so we couldn't use any of it because it was screen resolution. It would have never printed in a book. And we also, it was set for the screen, so the proportions were wrong and we couldn't fix the proportion issue. But you might think from that we would have learned a lesson, but of course we had to learn our own lesson. So when we were finishing up typesetting on the first edition of this book, our hard drive crashed. And at the time I was in Europe on the foreign business excursion with the Marriott School, and I get this panicked phone call, because we were only about 2 weeks away from our press deadline, that our hard drive had crashed and we had no current backup. The most recent backup we had was about a month old. And so we didn't lose everything, but it put us several weeks behind and we missed our deadline. And so it was really for that reason that this book was in paperback format first and then went to a hardback, because there wasn't time to hardback bind it by the time we caught up to where we were at. So disk space is cheap, just back up, back up, back up. One of my favorite little tricks to do is just to email myself a copy of stuff, because I figure then it's always out there in cyberspace somewhere. But having a good backup routine and habit is my last project management suggestion for today. There are others, but I'm out of time. So any last questions? No?
Do you have any other book recommendations besides the one you mentioned?
Can you give us the title of the first one again, too?
This book, it's the Non-Designer's Design and Type book by Robin Williams. And it's usually always used on campus, so it's usually always in the bookstore. But there are other recommendations. There's a book called Making a Good Layout that's just the basics. And there's, for more of a highbrow look at things, there's Edward Tufte's Visualizing Information or something like that is a good one. But other than the books, just the video tutorials I think are the other great thing.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, that's it. Thanks.